Lucas Moyen. I am a senior and a market process scholar, and I want to introduce Dr. Sam Staley. He has a BA in economics and public policy from Colby College and his MS in applied economics from Wright State University and a PhD in public administration from the with a capital T, Ohio State University. He is currently a professor and director of the DeVoe Moore Center at Florida State University. In addition to his responsibilities providing strategic direction and supervision of center operations and programs, he teaches advanced undergraduate and professional master's courses in social entrepreneurship, economic development, land use and regulation, urban policy, and research methods. Prior to joining Florida State, Dr. Staley was the Robert W. Galvin Fellow at the Reason Foundation, an internationally recognized public policy think tank where he worked on issues such as transportation system management and performance, private-public partnerships, growth management, and regulatory reform. While at the Reason Foundation, he traveled to China 30 times and managed the China Mobility Project, a academic research project that studied transportation policy and finance. And he has more than 25 years of experience in urban policy and is the co-author or editor of 5 books on public policy and more than 100 professional articles and reports. I had the great pleasure of getting to know Dr. Staley last May at Taffy Tap, which is Milton and Rose Friedman's home in Vermont, where a group of students met last summer to discuss the books Capitalism and Freedom and Free to Choose. There were a couple market process scholars there. And it was a great pleasure to meet him, and we're really thrilled to have him at the Taffy Tap today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's actually, thank you, Peter, actually, for actually inviting me to come into this space and talk about this issue. It's one that's been near and dear to my heart for a long time, although I have to say there's a bit of an out-of-body experience right now because I met Lucas and Riley in a completely different context. And so now I'm also in Charleston, which is an awesome city. Yeah, it's not the same as Tallahassee, Florida, or other places I've been. I love Charleston. Also, I've followed, at least from a distance, some of the land use and planning issues in South Carolina over the years. And so it's actually a real pleasure to be here and to just sort of see the city, get a sense of the vibe, meet some of you earlier in the reception area as well. What I want to try to do is spend about 25 minutes giving, which is unfortunately for you, a lecture, I guess. That's sort of hopefully imparts information. The reason I'm doing this is because I want to bring a certain frame to the way we look at planning and the way we look at how it actually operates in the US. And although, as I'm sure Riley and Lucas know, and certainly Pete does, I'm much more comfortable in discussion settings where that's where it's really cool to do that. But I think in order to get to the Q&A part, I think, and the way I have a way of looking at this process, I'm gonna have to do a little bit of lecture, but I do have a hard stop. So you don't have to worry about going to 10 p.m. listening to me talk about this. Wherever I am at 25 minutes, I'm going to stop, open up to Q&A. You are welcome to ask any question you have. I encourage you to have hard questions. What I found in land use, having been working in this area for more decades than I'm willing to sort of recite, is that the level of knowledge about planning can vary from 0 to actually quite detailed and experiential. So don't worry if you just have a basic question. Frankly, that basic question will reflect more knowledge than 99% of the American population on urban planning because you've given some thought to it. So I'm going to get into that part of it, but I want to get over through some of this basic stuff first. And just a little bit of context. I am an academic, but I am very much an applied academic, and my focus is urban policy. The reason I have all that stuff that's sort of in my bio is because I'm interested in how cities work. I'm interested in the housing market. And so I don't spend a lot of time in theory, although I value it and I use it all the time, but that's not where my professional focus is. My professional focus is on public policy, how it works, a big implementation guy. I spent a lot of time on that. And so it also reflects my own lived experience. So I've spent time on my board of zoning appeals in my local community. I was chair of my planning board for about 8 years. I was also chair of our charter review commission. So I understand how governance works. Now, not necessarily an expert on South Carolina, let alone Charleston, but a lot of that experience, what was happening in the public hearings, how we were trying to evaluate housing developments, going through a very significant period of housing growth, at least for our community at the time, really got me to focus on the practical realities of how the system works. So you're not going to get a lot of theory. What you're going to get is a lot of framing and some ways to think about this and where it comes from. So this is going to be a public choice perspective, because public choice is really the application of some core economic concepts to the political process, which includes, by the way, what for some is still a heretical idea that people in political spaces respond to incentives. They're not working purely from a philosophical perspective, although that actually, I think, counts more than a lot of people realize. But at the end of the day, processes work and people are human. We respond to incentives that's based on our own information, but also we respond based on our values as well and what we consider objectives. So I think public choice is actually particularly useful in thinking about how this process, how it works. All right. So, and also I am very concerned about trying to resolve conflict in public spaces and doing it in a way where people are not insulted, they are not offended. I personally run a very inclusive process, not only when I'm chairing a civic committee, but also when I'm running my classes. I run a center. We have about 30 students and faculty and staff that are involved in it. I'm very much about trying to move to a cooperative model as opposed to a conflict-based model. So I bring that frame in part to the way I look at land use, although it's a lot more challenging when you're dealing with planning. I'm going to explain a little bit why. Part of it is I think it's important to realize now that this issue is coming back into the fore of public discussion. A lot of it is over housing prices. And then just from the casual conversations I've had from people in South Carolina and Charleston, is that this is actually an issue here. I mean, this is not an affordable place to live. So what part of what I'm thinking about is how do we actually bring a housing market that may be out of balance into balance? And this is, I think, a particularly compelling graph. This is where I'm kind of the economist. I kind of go and look at some numbers and see if I'm completely out of whack on this. So, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get that to work. Well, anyway, you can see this is where the housing bubble that led to the financial crisis is hit here. Saw prices go down, things became affordable for the most part, depending on, of course, what industry you're in. But then you can see the steady increase in housing prices that have been going up. And actually, what's interesting about this is that these prices started going up during the pandemic. Supposedly, when we were in the middle of a recession and we lost a lot of jobs, at least some people were out of jobs, we still saw housing prices going up. And so part of this is, so the picture is actually pretty complicated, but and we're going to talk, I'll talk a little bit about that. Actually, I'm going to talk about that right here. So there are a lot of factors that are going into this. As an economist and as a policymaker, what we're concerned about is what is the relative importance of these different factors. So we clearly, what we have is cost of materials are going up. It's actually more expensive. You go buy a 2x4 or a 3x8 or whatever it might be, or a 2x10 at Lowe's. It's going to be a lot more expensive today than it was 4 years ago or 3 years ago. Part of that is tariffs. We have to recognize that public policy has had a role in this. We get a lot of lumber from Canada. And when we impose tariffs on those imports, costs go up. We do have supply chain disruptions. Lots of things just got screwed up because of COVID and various policies and various transportation sectors. And so getting products from abroad here was much more complicated, and we're still sorting that out. And we also have labor shortages. It's been really interesting as someone who's looked at labor markets for quite a while, particularly urban labor markets. Haven't seen a full recovery of the labor force participation rates after we had the lockdowns. And those lockdowns and the people that were in those jobs were actually in a lot of those jobs that were connected to some sectors of the economy that required laborers with those skill levels and those interests to actually be engaged in the economy. And a lot of them haven't come back. So part of this is actually getting the people to actually get the materials off the freight train and into a truck, getting somebody to drive the truck, and then have it delivered to its final destination. These things are still an important element. But there's also, which I think is interesting, housing demand. So we even though we had high unemployment, the economy was highly disrupted through public policy mainly at this point, but other things as well. We still found that if you had wealth, you are actually doing pretty well. Matter of fact, markets were just going up significantly. We were actually, when somebody could argue, actually, there are probably people in this room that are more knowledgeable about asset prices and financial markets, but we're probably in an asset bubble of some sort. And so what's going to happen is that maybe I had $300,000 in my bank account before, or I had 400,000, or whatever it might be. The asset value went up because we didn't see that the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns really had an effect on that. I have more assets. Maybe I'm living in a 1,000 square foot house with 3 bedrooms and one bathroom. Now I can afford a 4-bedroom house, and I have 2.5 baths in whatever market I'm in. So now I will go buy the house. New house hasn't been purchased, and actually they're not adding new houses because we don't know how the pandemic's going to actually sort out. So you don't have a lot of people with building new houses. So more demand, same level of number of housing, prices are going up. That's actually, and so now the question then is, do we know if this is a permanent shift or is it a temporary shift? We don't know. Actually, everything we've experienced over the last 4 years has been pretty extraordinary and pretty different. The other component of this is land. So all housing is built on land. The question is, how big is your building? How big is the footprint going to be? How high up are you going to go? And how far wide are you going to go in that? So to the extent that it is actually harder to bring land into production, into housing production, you're going to see the higher housing prices as people compete for different kinds of housing. So that is also an element. When we're talking about land use planning, most of the time, though not always, and I'll talk about some of those exceptions, we're talking about how land is being used. And we're talking about how you are actually able to use that land for different purposes, whether it's commercial, which is office buildings, or industrial or housing. And so that isn't, so the more constrained your land is for the most part, the higher housing costs are going to be, because it actually is more expensive to build higher density housing. Now there's some nuances, actually might get into Q&A if people want me to drill a little bit deeper on that. So that is an element of this. So there's a real question about whether or not the housing market is in equilibrium. Equilibrium economic concept, supply equals demand, and that's sort of the nirvana of the economics profession. I've got some theoretical issues with that, but I'm going to a therapist to deal with that kind of stuff. But we can talk about that maybe. But the higher housing prices clearly do represent higher demand. We know that people want to buy these houses. There's nobody being forced to buy a house that's a higher price. There is a shift in demand, in all likelihood, due to the asset bubble. And demand shifts more quickly than housing because you got to build a house, and it takes time to build the house. And these are capital investments. These are major investments that will last 20, 30, or 40 years, depending on when they become economically obsolete. Or I guess if you're in Charleston, they never become obsolete. They just get preserved in one way or the other. The question is where the housing units are going to be built at that point. So there's always, in a sense, this mismatch in the market, because you have housing, which is built to last for the most part, at least more than 5 or 6 years. So often 10, 20, 30 years. I'm living in a house that was built in 1949 by bootleggers, which is kind of cool from where I live. But anyway, that's another really interesting story that I could go into, but I still live in it. They, by the way, 850 square feet, 3 bedrooms, 1 bath. The family that built this house in 1949 raised 5 kids in a household. So that most people, I would doubt that there are many people in this room that are ready to live in 1,000 square feet with 5 kids and a partner. Whether you get rid of the partner or the kids, that's kind of up in the air maybe. But that house is still there, it's still being used. The difference is I'm living there by myself. I don't have 5 kids. So the densities have actually fallen pretty dramatically in that case, the number of people per land. So that we have these lags. And so for a developer, the question is, are we building the right housing for the right people at the right time? And that is actually as much art, probably more art than it is science. And it takes a lot of experience to get that right. But the other part of this, which is the what I really want to talk about, is a significant portion of these lags are actually created by the political process. In other words, developers would be more than happy to build housing faster and more of it if they were allowed to do that. Now, here's where things get interesting. So everything before this is principles of microeconomics. Go jump into any class and you can probably just take the supply and demand curve, layer over housing, and that's a pretty standard thing. Now things are, to me, are getting really interesting because we don't have a free market in housing. There are significant constraints on what you can and cannot do, and it's almost all politically driven, which lends itself to public choice analysis. So I just realized I changed the arrangement of some of my slides, so I now have to catch up to myself, which sometimes can be difficult. But anyway, one way to look at this is that when we think about decisions that are made in a non-individual setting, in other words, I'm just not making a decision about what water I'm going to drink or what I'm going to eat, but we're actually relying on other people to help us make those decisions. So if we gave that row a task to sort of decide how you want to divvy up the seats and what you were going to eat or whatever, you'd have to come together and work as a group to figure that out. We have all sorts of ways that we try to arrive at collective decisions in other words, decisions involving more than one person. We don't think about this a lot, though, and I think it's important to think about it in the context of public policy. We have certain values that drive us in a cultural sense of how we make decisions. Not every decision we make is actually a rational cost-benefit analysis. A lot of times we will make decisions based on collective values. Family will help us make those decisions. Our tribe, however we want to define it, will help us do that. It's private, by the way. It's not public. It's not public in the sense that you have a government engaged in you making that decision. It's that it could be a church. You get together with your church group and you sort of make a decision. It's all voluntary, but it's private. We also have economic markets, which are largely private. Actually, they're probably almost all private. That's kind of what we hear and learn about in principles and then take into different levels. That is also a private decision-making process. The difference is it's coordinated through a price system and through the supply and coordinating supply and demand and that part of it. But it's an different institutional structure, a different sort of way of making that decision with different rules than, say, working in your church group or working in any other private group. Then we have the political process. The political process is a formal way of making these decisions that have certain constraints on them. Who can participate, who cannot participate? Are they going to be appointed? Are they going to be elected? Whatever it might be. And what all of these are working together in one way. Are not always visible. We don't always see it. I can tell you that working as a chair of the planning board in my community, I saw all three of them working all the time. Almost every major decision that was at all controversial. And so the question then is, how do these things mix together? And then what happens in the process to lead to certain outcomes? And in the United States, our culture really privileges private decision-making over public decision-making. If we're in another place, certainly I've worked a lot in China, done some work in Europe on planning. Their processes privilege public sector decision-making. That's certainly true in land use and urban policy. But we have a strong culture of freedom in elections, as well as private property rights, which give us more scope for private decision-making than many other cultures in many other places. So we have this mixed approach. The question is, how's it all sorting out in all of this? Spend a little bit of time on this. I'm going to make this more of a conjecture rather than spending 15 minutes talking about this. But when we look at markets, where they tend to work is when we really don't know what people want and we can't predict it, where there's a lot of uncertainty. So what we don't want is a bureaucrat. And by the way, I'm using bureaucrat in a formal sense, not a pejorative sense. You could argue I'm a bureaucrat. I work for a state university. I work with a lot of planners that are working for governments. They're bureaucrats. Corporations have bureaucrats. So I'm talking about someone who administers policy or processes or programs. And so I don't want us to think that I'm using that in a pejorative sense. I'm not. My PhD is in public administration. We actually talked about bureaucrats as if they're noble individuals. So that's okay. So many of them are. But markets, legislative processes, and bureaucratic processes work in very, very different ways. And they are instituted to achieve certain outcomes. in different ways. And markets are really good at dealing with uncertainty. You don't know what to do and you don't know how to commit to it. You let people experiment. Use prices to sort of figure out, do I really want that 2x4? How many 2x4s do I really need? How many do I want? You go to Walmart, which has sometimes they have a lumber section, or you go to Lowe's, and then you have Lowe's figure that out by looking at prices. What are people going to buy and what aren't they going to buy? So markets are very good at working in that kind of an environment. It's also very dynamic. So in other words, we didn't sell as many 2x8s. Maybe we need more 2x4s. Within a week, with the way our system is set up, you could actually, if we actually had the supply chains working, you could actually have a correction in the market pretty quickly through that. However, there are times when there is a clear consensus, when you really want to achieve something, and it's like this entire room could get together and say, yep, 90% of us, we're on board with that. Actually, bureaucratic processes work pretty well in those kinds of environments. It's striking. But you need a consensus. You need to make sure the goals are clear. And you have to typically, and again, this is my public administration coming out, have to have administrative tasks that can be executed reasonably well and efficiently. And it can actually work really, really well. This is one reason why our criminal justice system is more bureaucratic than it is political or market driven, because we decided that we're going to have certain outcomes that we want to be applied consistently through the process. I'm not going to get into whether or not those are just. In all cases, in fact, we have some serious issues. But the reality is we don't want justice to be determined haphazardly without a sense of guidance or goals. So typically we'll see that happening. Then the legislative process is where you're really trying to figure things out. But you need a collective response. It can't be an individual response, but you need people to come to this room and, rather than listening to me lecture, really hash it out in a discussion, in a debate, come to a conclusion and hopefully stick with it. So when we're talking about whether we do things politically or whether we do things bureaucratically or we do things market, we really need to be paying attention to this stuff. My view is that housing is actually an incredibly diffuse and diverse dynamic industry. So bringing it into equilibrium is very difficult, even in a dynamic sense. All right, so political context for land use. This is why I think we have to be careful about using the market analogy to understanding how the housing market works. We really don't have meaningful property rights in terms of land use in the United States. There are a handful of places. Most of the United States, we don't. We have ownership rights to structures, and we have ownership rights to land, but we do not have rights to convert that land. In fact, all of those conversions, including the improvements, are actually are managed and through a permission-based system that involves the government. This really happened in the 1920s and 30s. Didn't actually happen when you guys were alive or even when I was alive. And we do this through zoning. And zoning is a map, a literal map, where the government has decided you can put this here, that here, something else here, someplace else over there. And even if you want to change it, you need the government to get permission and to change it. And sometimes those changes are defined in statute. In other words, we can say, on this parcel of land, we will allow you to go from 1 story to 4 stories. But you still need the government to get permission, because they actually had to create the map that allows you to do that and then create the conditions under which it can be converted. So we have collectivized land use, put it into a political process, and it's been that way for decades. The only major city in the US where that is not true is Houston. Now, I'm not going to go into Houston right now. It's actually a really interesting case study. But basically, for all practical purposes, I would be very surprised if in this room we didn't have more than a handful of people that were not living in cities or municipalities that were governed by a comprehensive plan approved by the local government with a land use map that implements that plan. There may be some rural areas in South Carolina where you still don't have to do that, but I'm not quite up to date. But I believe about 20 years ago, South Carolina mandated comprehensive plans at the county level with zoning maps. And so even if you're not in an incorporated place, you still have to conform to the zoning map. All right. So a little bit of detail up there where this comes from. Basically, what it comes down to is you need the government permission if you're going to change the land use of any consequence. My own view, looking at urban development for very long, well, actually 3 decades at this point, any development worth doing is going to require getting approval from the government to do it. It just simply is, everything else is just sort of replacing something else that was there before. It may look better, but it really doesn't functionally provide much more than before. So this is where public choice comes in. When part of this is, what does the economic frame help us understand? Well, as much as we may want to believe that everyone is involved in the political process for noble reasons and they are fully informed, that doesn't happen. By the way, I've been heavily involved in the process too, and as someone who's trying to manage these processes, it's actually quite interesting to see what people object to, what they don't object to, what they're willing to agree to in terms of data, and what they're willing to ignore in terms of data, depending on what they want to accomplish. No, there's nothing. So some of the things that we can think about if we take a public choice view, basically it just says people respond and make decisions based on their own interests, however those will be defined. It could be, I really think the government should be in charge of housing. All right, that's a values-based proposition. That is something you bring into the decision-making process. But you're going to make decisions based on whether or not that serves that interest of yours. So we have a diverse polity. We have a diverse group and community, but everybody's bringing a value system and a set of objectives and a set of goals. And so all we're saying is that you need to recognize that. A lot of my public administration training was this idea that somehow planners were working on this noble public interest view of government. In other words, they're always going to be looking for the best interest of the community. What they fail to recognize in a meaningful way is that even the planners have certain values about what cities should be. They bring their own priors into the process. And so they often will work in the system to the extent that they can to help guide the city in that direction. Now, what's interesting about American planning compared to European planning, and certainly a lot of Asian planning, is that our system privileges more the political decision-making process as opposed to the bureaucratic decision-making process. One of the things I admire about our urban planners is that they are professionals and they are usually very well educated. But they will always take a back seat to the elected official, almost always. No, not all the time. There've definitely been some projects that I've known have been sort of undermined by the planning staff, but it really doesn't happen nearly as often as people think. And the research shows that it doesn't quite, but that doesn't mean they're not actually optimizing over their own set of values and their own goals and objectives. So in economics, we can talk about constitutional economics as setting up the rules of the game. If we're thinking about planning, who has standing, who can actually come into a public hearing and actually object. We have rules for that in the legal system. Not everybody can just go into either a civil trial or a criminal justice trial, a criminal trial, and just start objecting and yelling and doing whatever they want. We actually have to be qualified to be in there at certain times. And same thing's true. So this is setting the rules of the game. Who actually makes the decision? In the US, it's ultimately going to be elected officials or citizens most of the time who are appointed by elected officials, people like me. I was an appointee making these decisions. That's the way the system is set up. It works very differently, and we have very different outcomes because we don't have professional planners that are actually making these decisions in most cases. Rent seeking, that's when people actually use the political process for their own private gain. That happens. Anytime you hear someone talk about the evil developer, almost always there's a rent-seeking story behind it. In other words, they're trying to manipulate the system so they can get this or that and undermine something else. But rent-seeking is not just a developer thing, it's a human thing when you set up a political process. I can go into all sorts of different mechanisms where that happens. We also have to be focusing on opportunity costs. That's another thing that economists bring in. It's like, okay, maybe we love this building we're in right now, which I actually think this is a pretty cool building for the most part. But the fact this land is being used the way it is means that something else is not being done. It's not being used for something else. So we have to always look at what the opportunity costs are, or what those trade-offs are. And then game theory is a big part of public choice, which is negotiation. How do we actually how this building, I would bet it would be a fascinating case study to look at how this building got approved and built. Just all the negotiation and the bargaining that had to happen through that. So this is all very different than from a public choice view of how this works. All right, so I'm going to talk about the tale of a tower. It's not the two towers, so we're not going to J.R.R. Tolkien and that type of thing. And then I'm going to do my hard stop and open up for Q&A. So this is interesting. To me, it was fascinating. We actually did a case study in my center on this. So this is a cell. Sometimes the one tower that rules them all, right? Is this cell tower right here. Now, what is I find interesting about this is that the cell tower is completely on private property. I mean, there's not, if it falls over, it's like 300 feet tall, falls over, doesn't affect any public infrastructure at all, period, or other housing. It's so insulated. In fact, this right here, that circle is where it is. Even if it would, on the top is actually an interstate, even if it would fall over, it wouldn't even hit the interstate at that point. So, and then you can see that the actual footprint, you're basically talking about some concrete blocks that sort of go into the private property. One property owner owns all the land. So something bad happens, it's just basically he's the only one that suffers from it. Took almost 2 years to get this approved. Almost 2 years to get this approved. So our question, why that's crazy? I mean, where's the public interest of delaying the cell phone tower? And so we actually mapped this process. Almost 2 years, 120 meetings with the local permitters and regulators. Okay, if it sounds crazy, it actually is crazy, but unfortunately, it's not uncommon to see this happen. And so I'm just using this for an illustrative purpose. So how did you actually go from a cell tower that's not going to affect anything that falls over? Basically, the owner of the tower is just going to suffer economic consequences, but that's all the burdens on them. There's not really a public burden that comes from this. That's not going to disrupt the utility grid. It's not going to disrupt the road system. Well, because every cell tower actually follows a permit approval process, which is actually follows a lot of kinds of permitting that almost every development, no matter how big or small, has to go through. These are the steps they had to go through. They had to first meet with growth management planners, decide whether or not it was something that they could actually get permitted. From an economic perspective, should have been permitted, should have been a no-brainer, just tick off a box, let them go forward. But the process is set up that it has to be reviewed. Then they actually had to do a market analysis. In other words, do we need another cell tower in Tallahassee? Maybe we have too many cell towers. Now, here's the interesting thing. It was illegal for the city to actually impose that. Cell towers are regulated by the Federal Communications Commission. And the states can't actually invest in that, or they can't actually make that decision. But nevertheless, if you're trying to get the cell tower up, all right, do we do the market analysis or don't we do the market analysis? How much time are we going to have to take to actually delay the project because we don't commission a consultant in 60 days to do a market analysis? They did the market analysis, satisfied them. They went to the next step. Next step, land use compliance certificate. Does that cell tower comply with the zoning of that map, of the zoning map? And they actually have to go through and make a formal decision on whether that's true. They have to check the box to do that. In Florida, we have what's called a concurrency application. So this sounds, I mean, this is like an economist's dream concurrency, because concurrency basically says whenever you have development, you need to make sure the infrastructure, the long-term infrastructure is there to support that development. Makes a lot of sense on paper. You're going to add 100 units of housing, going to generate traffic, make sure the roads can handle it, and you're not waiting 5 years for that to actually come online to reduce congestion, that type of thing. But it also applies to cell phone towers, which generate no real economic impact because it's part of the permitting process that comes with it. So they had to do a concurrency application, and they went through that. Oh, by the way, all these cost money. So in other words, there are all these permitting costs that go with it, depending on how big then they had to do a natural features inventory. That means they had to go inventory all the shrubs, all the plants, everything on the property that might be affected by it, because there might be an environmental impact that they weren't aware of. So, by the way, so they had to do an inventory of all the natural features that were in that footprint. Then they had to do the submission of the site plan. Okay, now you get through the inventory, you got all this stuff. Now you actually get it to be formally reviewed by the planning department. So we haven't even gotten to that part yet. Then you have a meeting and they sort of decide what they're going to do with that. Then you get the site plan approval. Then you have an environmental management permit that you have to do. There's no mechanism in this process to say it's a cell tower on private property. We're just going to administratively approve it. Nothing in that. And actually, that's pretty common in these processes. And that's one of the flaws in the system. And then you have the building permit application and the certificate of occupancy. All of this takes nearly 2 years for this this one cell tower. What I liked about the case study is it actually does mirror a lot of the processes that have been set up to manage growth in a lot of cities. It's not going to be in everyone. They rearrange some of this. And Florida might be a little bit more difficult than others because we imposed central planning and land use more comprehensively than most every other states. And that happened in 1988. All our counties and cities came in compliance in 1992 and 1993. But essentially, this is when the structure was put up. And also, it's interesting, we looked at other cell towers. And from an economist perspective, what we found is that you couldn't really predict how long it was going to take your cell tower to get approved at this point. So all of this stuff means that in the real world, compliance regulation actually contributes to the cost of building. And so our work has suggested before pandemic that this could be anywhere from 20 to 26% of the price of a house. It could be simply in the compliance planning process as part of that. Also, we find, and this shouldn't surprise a lot of people, and I really am going to end here, is that when we went in and looked at plans and what the plan approved in terms of densities versus what the plan allowed versus what was approved. Typically, the actual housing that is approved is significantly less than the densities that are actually been permitted in the plan itself. So the result is you're not building as much housing. And since you're not building as much housing, you still have the demand because in the United States, you can't limit people from moving from one state to the other. And people want to live in a house. I mean, I don't carry around a tent in my car. So in case I just want to stake it up at some place. So if you're not building the housing, but you have the migration going back and forth or even increasing, this imbalance gets even more and more severe. There are a lot of places in this country where these imbalances are very, very severe. And they are typically in the most planned areas of the country. California is terrible. I mean, California is almost nightmarish in terms of the choices that you have in terms of housing. Lots of other advantages to California, but affordable housing is not. My 800 square foot house would be $750,000 for in Redwood City in the San Francisco Bay Area. I can't afford that. I do pretty well as an economist, but not that well at that point. All right, let me stop here because as you can probably tell, I can go on a lot on this. I'm kind of interested in what your reaction to this is, what questions you might have about the process. And actually, my experience has been if I let you guys ask questions, most of the stuff I was going to talk about later is going to come up anyway at that point. So, start first of all, if anybody, what questions do you have about the process? And feel free to challenge me. I mean, it's not that I love debate, but I find that when people challenge me, that actually gets more interesting conversation. So I am happy to take whatever challenges there might be. Yes, Lucas, thank you.
So, a question about how all of this kind of plays into the general economic health of the country, and specifically economic mobility and the idea of the American dream. So, a lot of people's wealth is wrapped up in their houses, and I'm wondering if you've done any research on how this can affect the way that wealth transfers from parents to kids, or whether it makes it more or less likely that poor people can move to higher social classes, or vice versa.
Right. Great question. So the question is, how do these increases in prices that are really demand driven, but are changes in asset, how does that change? How does that affect intergenerational mobility? This is actually a big justice issue because what we find is that if you are coming from an upper income household and your parents have income and money, that you can buy into that more expensive apartment or that more expensive condominium. So if you are starting from a renter household or a low income household, your mobility options become significantly different. and it most affects minorities and people of color. So we find that Black family household income mobility is significantly affected by these housing price asset increases, because most of them are, well, not most, I mean, some in that cohort, there is a larger portion of people that simply can't, their parents can't help them get that down payment they need. They pay higher for the house because they're paying a higher mortgage and the interests are higher. So there are definitely significant equity impacts, and they do break along ethnicity and racial lines. But also probably, I think a lot of that covers for income as much as it does anything else. Unless you have a system that makes it more difficult for Black households to qualify for mortgages. And we do have those effects too. We see that in the literature, the academic literature. So those are, yeah, so when we start limiting housing supply, and then we're actually accommodating or supporting the increase in housing prices without a similar level and increase in income, you are making things less equitable and more challenging for future generations. Yes.
I feel like my question kind of bounces off Lucas's really well. I was going to say, in Charleston specifically, gentrification is a huge problem with our urban development. And I was curious if you had any thoughts or opinions on if there's an ethical way to pursue growth without displacing people. Right.
That's a great question. So can we pursue growth without displacing people? As a practical matter, that's really, really difficult. I've been immersed in the urban policy and urban planning world for a long time. Gentrification has been a big issue. I mean, we go back, I mean, a lot of our housing policies in the 1920s and 30s and 40s were actually built around gentrification issues. I think what we need to do, I don't think there's a way we can, while preserving civil liberties in the US and certain freedoms, really stop gentrification, because essentially what you're doing is you're stopping voluntary transactions. That's not to say that there aren't times when corruption has been an important element of this, and there certainly have, particularly in the bigger cities, use of eminent domain, which is the government seizure of property, that type of thing. Those are things we can stop. But the gentrification in terms of stopping willing sellers and buyers is something that's very difficult to do in the US. I think a better way to look at that is that if we're concerned about longtime residents or poor residents, is we have more targeted programs that actually address those needs. And I have personally worked as an expert witness in legal cases where I could have reconfigured the plan for the new housing development in a way that would have accommodated longtime residents that were at lower incomes. But the system is not always designed to optimize that. So it actually has to become a priority. So, and also from an economic perspective, if we look at, as a matter of fact, my urban economics class just went through this. We have a section on filtering. One of the most important ways that lower income households are able to access housing ownership is what we call filtering, which is newer housing becoming older housing, becoming cheaper housing. And then you access it at those levels. So I've never purchased a new house. I've always purchased used homes on the market. And so part of this is if you're interrupting the gentrification process, you also may be interrupting a natural filtering process that allows lower income households to actually access different kinds of housing. Not the same segment. So we're all competing for the housing in this one housing market. So it's a challenge. It's a political challenge. I would argue that gentrification, if that's an issue, is actually one of those. It's complicated enough. It needs to rise into the political process because there has to be a collective decision about what that priority is. But to the extent it disrupts housing market transactions, willing transactions, you're probably creating more problems than you're solving. And it is complicated. Yeah, great question. Yes. Oh, right.
My name is Benjamin.
So I have to ask you, where did you grow up? In Tallahassee.
I grew up by McClay.
Okay.
So yeah, I went to Florida High.
Okay.
So yeah.
Right.
You spoke on legislation and market and kind of how they interact. Are there any systems for holding legislators accountable? And if not, how do we work towards building them?
Yeah.
So that these issues don't happen?
That's a really interesting question. So is there a way to hold legislators accountable? In the US system, which is a pretty grassroots-based democratic system. It's a republic because we have representatives. The only way we can really do that is through elections, and which is a very imperfect mechanism. So one of the things, as I was sort of thinking about reframing how we would go about solving these issues, and this is sort of where I had to be very realistic about my role in society and my importance, which is like zero in all of this. Housing is almost never a top priority in elections. It's going to be a second priority, a third priority, a fourth priority. But if you're running for city council, and let's just say you're in Chicago, you're far more concerned about crime than you are about housing and land use. So the result is it never gets the priority. So the accountability doesn't come through the electoral process. So it depends on where you are. Actually, I would say that we've got this coming election cycle, meaning November, 8th or 3rd, I don't know what date it is. I did mail in, so I don't remember what the date, it's all done. Took care of it, out of mind, all that sort of stuff. There is accountability in the electoral process on some issues. I think we're going to find there's a lot of accountability on where elected candidates stand on abortion, for example. That's become a very high profile issue on the state level and very often on the local level too. But that's one, we go into the ballot box, we don't have enough candidates to vote on all our issues. We have to choose what are the highest priority. And so the consequence is that if you can't depend on the electoral process, what process do you use? And there, I think we got more scope. I actually believe that freer markets, if we're interested in solving housing affordability issues, if we free up the system, we're going to get more housing. That I think virtually everybody I know that works in this space would agree with that. Now, we may disagree on what kind of housing, but in terms of getting housing units to actually begin to match demand, we would get that. However, if you don't trust the market, then people are going to go to comprehensive planning and say, what kind of housing can you put in a certain neighborhood on a certain block? And the extreme case of that is probably our historical review in Charleston at this point, where it is so micromanaged that there's very little creative and innovative space you can do. And now, city has made a decision on that being a priority. So that is a collective decision. So part of that is deciding whether or not that is something you agree with. And that will have to be decided probably at the ballot box, because you don't want professionals who are experts, quote unquote experts, to necessarily make that decision. So anyway, you looked like you were going to follow up on something.
I guess I was more so referring to like the checks and balance aspect. This reminds me of like something I learned in my business law class about the Commerce Clause. And I'm pretty sure it's the Quill versus like Dakota case, where we ruled that it was unconstitutional for the Commerce Clause to like regulate gun violence and stuff.
Right.
So my point is here, is there any way to rule that like to take away the validity behind legislation that is impacting our housing market for unjust cause?
So it's unlikely.
Okay.
It's very unlikely, because the Commerce Clause, if it's the right clause that we're talking on the same thing, is really regulating trade across borders, right?
Well,
or is that what it? Or so clarify it for me.
I'm pretty sure Commerce Clause just like regulates federal and state like business, but it's among
Okay. Interstate commerce, right? Yeah, interstate commerce. So the federal government can't really become involved, and as a state, you can't actually, you can't directly impact what you can do in another state, right? So within a state, there's a lot you can do. In fact, Florida was a case where in 1988, they basically socialized all aspects of growth management. It wasn't just making it all collective. They required comprehensive plans at the county and city level, but it was also vertically integrated. There was a state plan, and your local plan had to be in compliance with the state plan. And over half of the first submissions by counties and cities were rejected by the state, the first round. So, but that was all swept away in 2010. with the Tea Party elections, and because it really constrained, a lot of constraints on housing was clearly getting out of whack at that point. So it's complicated. So the question is, as long as we respect property rights, as long as we respect civil liberties, and we think that those should be constitutionally guaranteed, there's very little you can do without some sort of a direct intervention on a very local level. So now there are exceptions, but they are exceptions for the most part. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Cool. And then I'll go back to you. Yep.
Well, a single cell tower on private property is a great example of regulation in the planning process. I think it'd be like negligent to assume that every example is so simple with only one stakeholder. I know that you're talking, so like, how do you find a balance between overregulation and then not enough regulation if there's more than one stakeholder involved?
Right.
Or there are many parties?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that's one of the things that economists hate doing case studies, because the question is how generalizable is it? One of the reasons I like this is because this particular case illustrates all the steps. All those steps apply to every other development, commercial development that's going to be applied in the city of Tallahassee. So you actually are seeing what a typical development permit would be faced with in the city of Tallahassee in that case. So, and certainly, well, as someone who's worked on planning boards in other states, these are not unusual steps. And the more regulated the state is, the more likely these steps are going to be involved. One of the things, and we're getting a little bit better in terms of trying to estimate what the actual impacts are on the housing markets and housing prices, but it's a really complicated issue. It's great to try to figure out what precisely the effects are, but that is a great question, and definitely. Can I go? I think she had her hand up, and then if we go.
Destruction and like
What?
Ian and the destructive forces of the environment and wildfires and earthquakes and all these things, and planning who and how is it decided that, hey, let's rebuild?
Yeah, it's largely a political question, but it's also a personal question. So part of it has to do with the way our insurance markets are structured. Do you have replacement insurance for your house if it gets blown away? I'm from Ohio, where we had tornadoes, very similar types of problems. Actually, we had one of the most destructive tornadoes in the country, just a mile away from where I lived and grew up. So ultimately what it comes down to, and it really is going to come down to the individual locality. Sometimes you'll have state regulation. And in Florida, what we've had is after the big one that came through like 20 years ago.
Andrew.
What? Andrew. Yeah, when Andrew came through, we had a major change in the building codes in order to strengthen them to protect. And actually what we found is that if your buildings were created post Andrew, they actually experienced very little destruction. Now, when you get a storm surge of 10 or 15 feet, it's a different story altogether, because your house is still up, but there's nothing left in there. And if you were in there, you would have drowned and died. So there are statewide building codes that are typically reformed. It almost always takes a political event of a really tragic proportion before you'll get those changes. And then very often those changes are applied in a way that do not reflect individual circumstances. So you will have houses that are outside of flood zones that now have to be built as if they're going to withstand a Category 5 hurricane. And so that drives up costs as well. But other than that, it's a lot of local communities, counties and cities making adjustments to their requirements. In many ways that works better, because they can provide regulation that's more contextual to the particular environment. Certainly Tallahassee, I don't have to worry about flood surge or storm surge because I'm 272 feet above sea level, which makes me the second highest point above sea level in Florida. So anyway, yes. Oh, did that answer your question? Okay, yes. And then back here.
Follow-up / maybe answer to Katie's question. Do you think it would make more sense to have, because I know you said the cell tower example shows you the process that almost every permit has to go through. Would you say it makes more sense to have different processes for maybe different classifications of developments, like smaller stakeholders perhaps have less steps to go through versus
great question.
Huge projects?
Yeah. And so my last slide, which I didn't get to, actually talks about this. What is the way out? I believe that we actually have to scrap the current system, because I think there are too many flaws in the way the system is designed. too many people can enter. So if you, I would be very surprised if this wasn't true in Charleston. Most cities, if you are going to say create a subdivision of 30 or 50 or 100 houses, anybody in the county, anybody in the country could actually come in and object. And the way the process is set up, and these are some of the informal things that you begin to experience and see when you're actually part of the process, is once controversy becomes enmeshed in a cooperative decision-making system, the net result is stasis, no change. And I really saw this happening over and over and over again, because what would happen is someone would say, well, what about this? What if they come in and this is what happens to this river's flow? And even if you could create, and actually we would do this, we actually commissioned studies, what's going to happen if we create this building, what's going to happen to stormwater runoff, how's it going to affect houses that are downstream from that? And even when we can come up with numbers that show that actually we have tried to control for that and manage that as much as possible, people will still object. So now as a commissioner, I'm thinking, okay, I know what the numbers say, and I'm an economist, so I believe in numbers, right? I'm a social scientist. I know what I personally believe, I know what the best decision is. But how much do I have to really pay attention to my constituency, the people that are living next to the development? And even if they're objecting, that maybe I need to be giving that weight as a political part of the process, as opposed to the numbers part. And very often what happens, and this is very common, and we can see this over and over again in decision-making, is that once you insert controversy in an open system of activism, the decision moves towards stasis. An innovation is not, or a dramatic change from the current status quo is not embraced. And another manifestation of that is adding more and more conditions or layers to the approval, which adds delay, adds costs, makes it more expensive, which also limits the number of suppliers that can enter into that market. We have a development that's going up in Tallahassee right now. It's a $200 million Amazon distribution system, or building. It's state of the art. It's on, I think, if I remember right, it's on about 75 acres, owned by one person, easy to sell, not a lot of other kinds of costs. He spent $10 million just to prepare the land in the event it might be developed for commercial purposes. And this was 10 years ago. There are very few builders and developers that have $10 million in their back pocket, or they can go to the bank and make that work. So what happens is large developers and large builders actually become privileged in the system. Great example of that is California. There are no small house builders in California anymore. Very big state, but you can't afford it because the compliance costs are so high. You need to figure out a way to fund millions of dollars in the upfront part of the process. Yes.
I just had a question on set aside. So does Florida have set aside program? South Carolina, you can't mandate them. But
Okay.
New Jersey, I think mandated at the state level.
Right.
And then I also, in addition to set asides, I believe Canada
Yeah.
is outlawing Wall Street from buying single family homes or something.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit
Yeah.
set asides and then banning Wall Street?
First, can you define what you mean by set asides? Because, by the way, one of the things you find in this is that terminology changes wherever you are.
People
So
in Chicago, New York for years, if you were
Right.
going to do a project, you had to put, 20-30% of the units aside for
Okay.
workforce and senior
All
housing.
right. So that's the term that's most often used as inclusionary zoning or inclusionary housing. So you can do that. It depends on the state, what a state enabling legislation allows you to do that. And we have, I know it's true in California, that's actually a common practice there. And there are cities in Florida that they can do it if they want. In other words, what we have is a system where we've gotten rid of the state oversight, but the cities can do pretty much anything they want. So if you wanted an inclusionary zoning program in that, then you could do that. The problem with that is that essentially what you're doing is you're just increasing the cost of housing because somebody's got to pay for those units that are now sub-market and when they're below the market. And we found as a practical matter, we add units on paper, but we don't add enough to influence the market to actually increase affordability. And essentially it's the upper income households that are subsidizing the lower income households, which means that housing prices go up. So the short answer is yes, we can do it. The longer answer is that the effects aren't often what we think we're going to get. But it can be done. But you have to look at state enabling legislation to know if you can do it locally in South Carolina. 1 minute. You can? Okay. All right. Yeah.
Everybody spies out.
Yeah, well, they didn't
just
increase, they didn't increase the tax. Yeah.
Right. So in a lot of cases, what happens is that it just, in Florida, this happens a lot, whether it's not inclusionary zone, we have parks and open space ordinances, and you basically provide a impact, not an impact fee, a development fee that then goes into a affordable housing pot, which can be distributed in all sorts of different ways. Or they do that with open space as well. We have a requirement in my community, we had an open space requirement. And basically what it meant is a certain percentage of whatever the value of the housing development was going to go into an open space park fund. And that would go someplace else. So there's that part of it. Yeah. I mean, so, yeah. Right. Right. And now on the Wall Street thing, I think that's going to be a lot more complicated because it's very difficult to target individual groups or individuals in terms of their investment. I'm curious to see how that actually plays out. I don't have a lot of insight into that at this point. Although some of our researchers at Florida State have actually have looked at investor-owned properties in the aftermath of the pandemic to see what happens to neighborhood effects. And actually, investor-owned properties are problematic. So you need to turn them over in order to stabilize the community, keep affordable housing, and avoid inequities in the market. You're better off with actual property owners owning the properties and not investors. And so that's an effect. But in terms of the policy response, I don't have a good solution. Sorry.
I'm going to take the prerogative of the last question.
Okay. All right.
Probably not an easy one, maybe, but still want to do it. So early on, when you were talking about putting this stuff in place in the 20s and 30s and the zoning laws, right? I wanted you to give us just a quick summary of some of the history of those things, because the motivations for introducing a lot of these regulations are very different than what we think now. And so now we hang on to these ideas of, oh, we want housing, we want zoning, it's important for us, it protects us and so forth. And yet those weren't necessarily all the motivations that were in there historically. So I thought maybe we could just take a second and talk about that.
And there's actually been some interesting research on this. It's a fascinating history of how planning got implemented in the US. So going back to what I was saying before, we have the public interest view that if we just had if we had specialists, experts, figure out where the housing should be, where the factory should be, that would be a better planned community. And then there's the other rent-seeking version, which is that if I can get this zoning through, then I'm going to be able to profit directly from it. What we find is that it's mixed. It's both. It's not one or the other. There is a public interest element to it because the planning profession is driving some of these changes. But there's a very strong rent-seeking component that goes with it too. And in fact, planning empowered elected officials in ways over the market in ways that weren't completely unanticipated. So it's so basically it was because what we call in urban planning the growth machine actually found a way to use it, and that then could be used to fund elected officials. You've actually found a lot of rent seeking going on, but then it was enabled by a public interest view, which was very naive in the way the whole process would work. Current urban planning is not nearly as naive as they were in the 1920s and 30s, but they're struggling with how to work with this. And I will conclude on one thing, is that I think the way to get ourselves out of this is if we move the planning process, and this goes back to where I was actually going to go with your question, and I just forgot. If we focus on the impacts of development, we can solve most of these problems. What I found is I started getting less conflict in my planning commission, and we're able to move projects that were in the community interest that actually included goals that maybe the developer or the property owner weren't so excited about. Once we began refocusing the conversation on general values and sort of objections and focusing on the actual impact of the development. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out why do I have all these people complaining? And then I started restructuring the public hearing process to allow those voices to be more transparent. And what I found is that they were objecting to 150 houses. Well, they really weren't. What they were objecting to was the traffic that was going to be developed. What they were objecting to was the stormwater runoff that was going to happen and might affect their properties. And as soon as we began to move that conversation to focusing on the impacts of what the planning is. One, it's a much more property rights and market friendly approach, but we began to resolve conflict. And then we were able to move things forward. People didn't think that 150 units was going to really destroy their world anymore. It's like, oh, actually what we do, and we actually did this, we said, yes, there's going to be more traffic. We can actually estimate what the traffic is. They're going to have to pay for the road improvements to handle that traffic. And they were fine with that. Developers are fine with that. You show them the impact, you give them a reasonable reason to do it, and they will accommodate. And I've seen that happen in a number of different cases. So that's my concluding point on this. Thank you, Pete, for having me in. Thank you guys for listening. You're good.